Before we begin this incredible story about the Grumman F5F Skyrocket, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. We are just starting out, and your support is essential for this project to continue growing. If you like little-known stories about military aviation and want to see more content like this, leave a like and activate the bell so you don't miss anything. Now let's get to the story. In the long, winding story of American aviation during the Second World War, names like Mustang, Thunderbolt, and Hellcat tend to dominate the sky of memory. But there were others less heralded, less remembered, whose stories faded into the background of history, not because they lacked merit, but because timing, politics, or institutional conservatism dimmed their light before it could shine. Among those aircraft was the Grumman F5F Skyrocket, a sleek, bold experiment in twin-engine design that flew into obscurity before ever having the chance to prove itself in the crucible of combat. The tale of the Skyrocket is one of innovation, overshadowed, potential unfulfilled, and a place in history never quite earned, though perhaps never truly deserved to be forgotten. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had already built a reputation for producing rugged, effective naval fighters. Their biplanes, and later the monoplane F4F Wildcat, showed that Grumman understood what naval aviation demanded: strength, durability, ease of maintenance, and the ability to take punishment and keep flying. In the late 1930s, however, the Navy and, by some stretch, the Army Air Corps as well were beginning to flirt with new ideas. Twin-engine fighters had long been a fascination. They promised greater speed, longer range, and more firepower. But on carriers they posed serious challenges: heavier weights, longer takeoff runs, and less forgiving landings. Still, Grumman believed they could crack the code, and the result was the bold F5F Skyrocket. It was a plane that looked like something out of a Buck Rogers comic strip. With its short, stubby fuselage nestled between two long, gleaming engine nacelles, it didn't resemble anything else flying in the skies of 1938. The twin, 1,200 horsepower Wright R182 Cyclone engines gave it power to spare, and its clean lines suggested a bird that could move with authority. The cockpit was set well forward, offering the pilot excellent visibility, and the aircraft featured tricycle landing gear, a rarity in carrier aircraft at the time, which made it more manageable on the ground. In many ways, it was ahead of its time. But being ahead of your time doesn't always mean you'll be appreciated. The F5F flew for the first time in April 1940, and initial impressions were promising. Test pilots praised its speed and rate of climb. It outflew many contemporary single-engine fighters in mock dogfights, including the Wildcat, which was then still coming into its own. Pilots loved its responsiveness and the way it handled like a much smaller aircraft. It was fast, agile, and robust. Yet even as it demonstrated its potential, doubts lingered. Carrier captains raised concerns about deck handling. The Skyrocket was heavier than they were used to, and its wide stance meant it took up valuable space on already cramped carriers. Then there was the question of doctrine. American naval aviation, still finding its identity in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, leaned conservative. Twin-engine fighters were an unknown quantity at sea, and the Navy brass didn't relish the idea of gambling with their limited carrier resources on a design that, while promising, carried with it many unknowns. Better, they thought, to stick with what was working. The Wildcat wasn't flashy, but it was tough, reliable, and could be mass-produced. The Skyrocket, by contrast, seemed experimental, exotic, even risky. One of the more compelling what-ifs in American aviation history came in the form of a pilot who fell in love with the Skyrocket, a young lieutenant commander by the name of Butch O'Hare, who would later win the Medal of Honor flying the F4F Wildcat. O'Hare reportedly flew the Skyrocket in a trial and raved about its capabilities. He believed it had the potential to dominate the skies over the Pacific. But his enthusiasm was not enough to change the tide of institutional inertia. There were no enemies yet in the skies to justify radical change. The Navy needed standardization, not innovation. It needed quantity over flair. Even more frustrating was the fact that by the time war broke out, the F5F had already slipped into obscurity. The Navy had chosen not to order it into production, and only a handful of prototypes were ever completed. The design was quietly shelved in favor of more traditional single-engine fighters, and Grumman redirected its energies into improving the Wildcat and developing what would become the F6F Hellcat, a plane that would go on to cement Grumman's place in history. The Skyrocket, meanwhile, was consigned to the realm of testing and research. A few continued flying as experimental platforms, but their moment had passed. It was an odd fate for an aircraft that had shown such promise. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder how things might have been different. The Skyrocket was faster than many production fighters of the time. Its twin engines offered redundancy in combat and the ability to loiter longer on patrols. It could carry more firepower and had ample space for radar or reconnaissance equipment. In a war that would eventually demand versatility, speed, and long-range punch, it's tempting to imagine the Skyrocket deployed in the Solomon Islands, or escorting bombers over Rabaul. But wartime production decisions are rarely made on potential alone. They are made on reliability, predictability, and most of all, economy. And in 1941, with war looming and production lines strained, the Navy saw in the F5F not an opportunity, but a distraction. It didn't help that the Army Air Corps also declined interest. They too were fixated on their own vision of what a fighter should be: long-ranged, single-seat, fast. The P-38 Lightning, another twin-engine fighter, had already secured its place in the Army's doctrine, and there was little room for a navalized cousin. That brought more complexity than promise in their eyes. So the Skyrocket vanished, not with a crash or scandal, but with a whisper. No dogfights, no victories, no kill markings painted on its nose. Just silence and the slow turning of pages in technical manuals as engineers looked to other designs. Yet the story didn't quite end there. In the years that followed, as jet engines became the new frontier, Grumman took many of the lessons learned from the F5F and folded them into future designs. The experience of building a fast, agile, twin-engine fighter paid dividends later, just not in the way the Skyrocket's creators had originally hoped. And curiously enough, the F5F Skyrocket would live on not in the pages of military history books, but in the pages of comic books. In the 1940s, a character named Black Hawk, a dashing aviator hero, flew a stylized version of the Skyrocket as his personal fighter. Millions of young readers came to know the Skyrocket not through war stories, but through pulp adventure. Its image, sleek and futuristic, fired imaginations even as the real aircraft gathered dust in hangars. In that sense, the Skyrocket became something rare, a forgotten weapon that lived on as legend. Not because of what it did, but because of what it might have done. In a time when America was reaching for the skies with boldness and ambition, the Grumman F5F Skyrocket was a bold leap that just missed the moment, but left its mark in ways no one quite expected. As 1941 edged closer to its violent turning point, Grumman engineers continued to quietly refine the F5F Skyrocket in hopes that it might still find a place in American air power. While the Navy had made its decision not to order the aircraft into mass production, the prototypes were still very much active, flying out of test fields and naval stations along the East Coast. These flights, often quiet and undocumented outside of engineering circles, were opportunities to tweak the airframe, refine its handling, and test systems that might later benefit other fighters. For Grumman, the F5F wasn't just a rejected aircraft. It was a living experiment. It was during these months that the Skyrocket arguably performed at its best. In simulated combat exercises, Pilots praised its blistering climb rate and sharp turns. It could out-accelerate most of the aircraft it faced and had the added confidence of a second engine, which not only boosted power but provided a critical backup in case of failure, something that single-engine carrier pilots could never count on. The aircraft's cockpit layout also impressed experienced aviators. Set well forward, the pilot had nearly unobstructed visibility ahead and to the sides, a feature that would be cherished in dogfighting, carrier landings, and close ground attack support. But that visibility also highlighted one of the F5F's most unusual characteristics: its extremely short fuselage. The twin engines were mounted far forward on the wings, and the nose section seemed truncated compared to conventional fighters. To the untrained eye, the design looked awkward, perhaps even underdeveloped. But it was highly functional, giving the aircraft a compact footprint that allowed for rapid maneuvering. Unfortunately, this unconventional appearance did little to endear the Skyrocket to decision-makers at the Pentagon or within the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, who were still prone to favor designs that looked familiar, even if they didn't perform better. Some within Grumman's inner circle began to suspect that the Skyrocket's greatest failing wasn't mechanical or tactical. It was psychological. The aircraft didn't look right to some eyes, and that hurt it more than anyone cared to admit. American military leaders were accustomed to certain silhouettes: long noses, centralized engines, elegant frames. The Skyrocket broke that mold entirely. It didn't look like the aircraft in recruiting posters. And in a time of growing national uncertainty, familiar things felt safer. That prejudice, unspoken as it was, clung to the Skyrocket like drag. As America plunged into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, all attention shifted to fast-tracking the proven tools of combat. Factories roared to life. Assembly lines churned out F4F Wildcats by the thousands, and Grumman was fully absorbed in meeting the crushing demand. The Skyrocket, a prototype with no formal production order, was left behind. Its experimental nature made it unsuited for rapid rollout, and the Navy needed every fighter it could get now. There was no time to entertain what might have been. Every engineer and riveter at Grumman was redirected to the Wildcats, Avengers, and later the Hellcats. But in the shadows, a few test pilots still whispered about the Skyrocket. Some believed it would have excelled in the Pacific theater. It had the legs to cover more ocean than the Wildcat, and the power to climb above many Japanese fighters before diving into combat. It could have served as a superb long-range escort, something sorely lacking in the early war years. Others envisioned it as a high-speed recon platform, slipping in and out of dangerous territory with two engines and enough agility to evade pursuit. Still others saw potential for night fighting, especially with modifications for radar and advanced optics. But none of these visions came to pass. The Skyrocket remained grounded in bureaucracy and the realities of wartime production. The irony was that even as the F5F was left behind, American engineers were beginning to realize the need for exactly the kind of capabilities it offered. The war in the Pacific was sprawling and unpredictable. Fighters needed range, resilience, and adaptability. The arrival of the Japanese Zero forced American designers to rethink everything. Suddenly, agility mattered more than brute strength. Range became the currency of survival. The F5F, with its twin engines and superior performance envelope, could have met those needs if only it had been given the chance. Meanwhile, Grumman's design teams looked to the future. While the Skyrocket languished, lessons learned from it fed directly into their next major project, the F6F Hellcat. In many ways, the Hellcat represented a compromise between the Wildcat's ruggedness and the Skyrocket's advanced handling. It wasn't a twin-engine aircraft, but its wide undercarriage, improved visibility, and upgraded power plant bore the fingerprints of what had been learned from the F5F. The Skyrocket, then, did not die in vain. It served as a bridge not to itself, but to something else. Something that would go on to become the backbone of the Navy's fighter force. There was one brief moment, though, when the Skyrocket seemed poised to step back into the light. In early 1942, with the war effort still chaotic and the Navy desperate to experiment with all possible solutions, there was renewed internal discussion about using the remaining Skyrocket prototypes for limited operations or advanced training. Some engineers pushed hard, suggesting new wing designs and improved avionics could modernize the aircraft. But the effort fizzled before it began. The Navy needed standardization, not one-off reinventions. The Skyrocket, once again, was grounded still. The aircraft refused to vanish entirely. One of the remaining prototypes was quietly transferred to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the forerunner to NASA, where it served as a high-speed research platform. In this role, it found a new purpose, contributing to data gathering on twin-engine stability, high altitude, aerodynamics, and power management systems. It was not the role it had been built for, but it was valuable nonetheless. Its clean lines, once dismissed as odd, now offered engineers a reliable baseline for comparison. In these flights, the Skyrocket offered glimpses of what it might have become. And then came the comics. Blackhawk, a war hero with a taste for action and justice, took to the skies in a fictional version of the F5F Skyrocket. While the comic book aircraft was stylized and more flamboyant, its inspiration was clear. For a generation of American kids in the 1940s and 50s, the Skyrocket wasn't a forgotten footnote. It was the coolest plane in the world. Sleek, fast, and flown by heroes. In a strange twist of fate, the plane's legacy would be carried not by squadron histories or war memorials, but by ink and imagination. Veteran pilots who had once flown the F5F in test squadrons, occasionally, gave interviews in later years, reminiscing about the aircraft with a kind of nostalgic sadness. One Navy pilot, now gray and retired, called it the best fighter we never flew. Another described it as a rocket with wings too advanced for its time, and we just didn't know what to do with it. These were not exaggerations. 2. Those who knew its performance firsthand, the Skyrocket represented a lost opportunity. Not a failure, but a case of history moving in a different direction. The tale of the Grumman F5F Skyrocket is in many ways a quintessential American story. It's the story of a bold idea born in an age of caution, a fast car on a road filled with traffic jams. It is a reminder that success in aviation isn't always about being the best on paper. It's about being in the right place at the right time, with the right people behind you. The Skyrocket had speed, agility, and presence, but it lacked timing. And in the theater of war, timing is everything. By the middle of 1943, the tide of the war had begun to shift. American industry had hit its stride, and the skies above the Pacific were slowly becoming more crowded with Wildcats and Hellcats, Corsairs and Avengers. Grumman, now the backbone of the U.S. Navy's fighter power, had long moved on from the Skyrocket. Yet among a small circle of test pilots and aviation enthusiasts, the aircraft's legend remained. It hadn't fought in battle, hadn't claimed any victories, but it had earned a place in the hearts of those who understood what it could have been. The Skyrocket, though shelved, wasn't entirely forgotten. One of the most intriguing elements of its legacy was the influence it exerted behind the scenes, quietly, subtly, on how designers approached future American aircraft. The forward cockpit layout, so striking in the F5F, became more common in designs aimed at improving pilot awareness. The tricycle landing gear, once seen as unconventional for a naval aircraft, would become standard with the advent of jets. Even its stubby fuselage, once mocked, served as a lesson in weight distribution and engine placement. Those lessons made their way into classified drawings and proposals for aircraft that would never see the light of day, and some that would. There's no direct blueprint tracing from the Skyrocket to the F9F Panther or the F11F Tiger. But ask any Grumman engineer who worked on those jets, and many would tell you the same thing. The Skyrocket taught them a lot. It was a plane that gave the company courage to push boundaries, even when the bureaucracy of war had little appetite for risk. Throughout 1943 and 1944, there were isolated attempts to revisit the Skyrocket's concept, with the Hellcat now dominating. The skies and the Navy's fighter doctrine clearly leaning into single-engine aircraft with ever-increasing horsepower. The idea of a twin-engine carrier fighter once again started to stir in technical discussions. Some considered mating more powerful engines to the F5F airframe and converting it into a fast night fighter, equipped with radar and onboard detection systems. The war in the Pacific, after all, was now seeing more night raids and naval engagements. In poor visibility, but these were ideas born too late. The Navy had moved forward, and there was little political capital left to spend on a resurrected prototype. It didn't help that the F7F Tiger had a much more powerful and advanced twin-engine fighter was already being developed. Though the Tigercat would also struggle with deployment from carriers, its arrival sealed the Skyrocket's fate as obsolete. There simply wasn't room on the flight deck or the budget sheet for another experiment. Ironically, in 1944, one of the Skyrocket prototypes was briefly recommissioned for a short period of radar testing. It was fitted with early detection gear and flown in simulated night intercepts along the East Coast. The results were promising, but by then the war's momentum was too strong in other directions. The effort was quietly canceled after a few months, and the aircraft once again returned to storage. Yet those flight records still survive, buried in archives. Handwritten notes describing an aircraft that had no business flying so well with equipment it was never designed to carry. For many who encountered the Skyrocket, even briefly, the most lasting impression was emotional. Pilots who had trained on sluggish Wildcats or temperamental Brewster Buffaloes couldn't believe how smoothly the F5F responded. In the words of one test aviator, "It felt like she knew what I wanted before I moved the stick." That kind of intuition in flight was rare, and for many, addictive. Some would go on to fly Corsairs and even jets, but they would still remember the F5F as the one that got away, outside of the hangars and airfields. However, the public had a very different relationship with the Skyrocket. Thanks to the Black Hawk comics, which by 1944 were among the most popular war-themed publications in America, the aircraft was enjoying a second life. Drawn with exaggerated proportions and blazing guns, it was featured on covers, in dogfights, against fictional enemy aces, and in fantastical missions around the globe. Millions of American boys cut out pictures of the Skyrocket from comic pages and pasted them on their bedroom walls. They had no idea the real aircraft had been shelved. Years earlier, this unexpected fame made its way back to Grumman, where some engineers couldn't help but smile. The aircraft that the Navy had turned down was now being flown by the most daring hero in pop culture. It was a small consolation perhaps, but a meaningful one. The comic book version of the Skyrocket inspired a generation of kids to dream about flight, to build model airplanes, to imagine streaking through the clouds with twin engines roaring behind them. In that sense, it did what no procurement order or Navy directive ever could. It captured the American imagination. As the war neared its end in 1945, the remaining Skyrocket airframes were either dismantled or stored away permanently. No museum wanted them. They had never seen combat, had never landed on a carrier deck in wartime, and had no dramatic victories to boast. At best, they were considered engineering oddities valuable for what they taught, but not worthy of public display. A few black and white photos, some grainy film reels, and a handful of blueprints were all that remained. But every once in a while, a young naval aviator flipping through archives or old publications would stumble upon an image of the Skyrocket and pause, Something about the aircraft's design felt fresh, daring, even futuristic. The stories attached to it were few, but those that survived hinted at something special. A plane that could have changed the war, if only the war had waited for it. In the post-war years, as jet technology rapidly made most piston-engine fighters obsolete, the Skyrocket's legacy quietly transitioned from what it was to what it symbolized. For some, it represented American innovation unchained, an example of what happened when engineers were allowed to dream. For others, it was a case study in missed opportunities, how bureaucracy, conservatism, and production constraints could snuff out brilliance before it had time to bloom. As aviation museums began cropping up across the country in the 1950s and 60s, some veterans wrote letters suggesting that a Skyrocket be restored for public view. But the aircraft had disappeared too completely. No intact models remained. A few surviving parts, perhaps a wing section here or a tailpiece there, ended up in storage crates, mislabeled or long forgotten. Restoration would have required starting from scratch, and without a war record, there was little public or institutional appetite to support it. Still, the memory lived on, passed down not in headlines or documentaries, but in footnotes, in the recollections of aging pilots, in engineering conference rooms where younger designers still heard mention of that old twin-engine Grumman job from before the war. And of course, in comic books found in dusty attics, where a different version of the Skyrocket continued to win the day. Battle after battle, decade after decade. It is easy to forget the ones that didn't make it. History tends to focus on the victors, the flag wavers, the machines of glory. But the Skyrocket has refused to be entirely forgotten, even without victories to its name. Maybe that's because it appeals to a certain American spirit, a belief in potential, in second chances, in the idea that the best sometimes never gets to show what it can do, yet still deserves to be remembered. By the late 1940s, the aviation world had changed beyond recognition. Jets were no longer a novelty, they were the future. The Navy was commissioning aircraft that could outrun sound, and piston engine designs that had dominated World War II were being retired at an astonishing pace. Aircraft that had once been the pride of the fleet were now obsolete, sold for scrap, or displayed in small-town memorial parks. The Grumman F5F Skyrocket, which had barely existed to begin with, faded even further into obscurity. For most people, it was never more than a forgotten prototype, a what-if in the footnotes of a different war. But in a handful of engineering departments, particularly within Grumman itself, the legacy of the Skyrocket was not so easily dismissed. Among the blueprints and research notes that had once fueled its brief moment in the sun were technical concepts that would inform the post-war generation of aircraft. The idea of a fighter with exceptional forward visibility and twin-engine redundancy found new life in the design of jet-powered naval aircraft. Many of the aerodynamic theories tested in the Skyrocket lift distribution across wide nacelles, centerline pilot positioning, and pitch stability with compact fuselages echoed in later designs like the Panther and Cougar. By the 1950s, as Cold War tensions turned attention toward faster interceptors and advanced jet technology, the Skyrocket story might have ended for good if not for a curious resurgence. Aviation magazines, always hungry for forgotten oddities, ran occasional retrospectives on lost aircraft of World War II. One such article, published in 1952, featured the F5F Skyrocket prominently. It included a sharp three-view drawing, a brief performance summary, and a glowing quote from a former Navy pilot who had tested it. It could have given the zero pilot's nightmares if it had gone to war. Readers, many of whom were veterans themselves, were fascinated. Letters poured in, asking why they'd never heard of this strange twin-engine bird. These moments of rediscovery were brief, but they kept the Skyrocket just barely afloat in the collective memory of American aviation. In fact, several model kit companies took notice. Though no combat photos existed and only limited technical data had survived, companies like Aurora and Revo released plastic model kits of the Skyrocket during the mid-1950s, sometimes inaccurately labeled as Black Hawk's fighter due to its comic book fame. These models found their way into hobby shops and basements across the country. For the first time since its cancellation, the aircraft became a tangible object again, glued together, painted with testers enamel, and set proudly on boys' bedroom shelves. And then there were the comic books. Throughout the 1950s and well into the 60s, Black Hawk comics remained a fixture of wartime fantasy storytelling. Though the real aircraft had been long retired and forgotten by the Navy, the fictional version of the Skyrocket was still streaking through the skies, now drawn with even sleeker lines, armed with futuristic weaponry, and flown by a team of global heroes. The comic's longevity meant that a generation who had never even heard of the actual plane came to associate the name Skyrocket with daring rescues and heroic dogfights. Ironically, it was fiction that cemented the aircraft in public memory far more effectively than history ever had. As the decades wore on, America's relationship with its wartime legacy matured. The 1960s brought with them a renewed interest in World War II history, especially as veterans reached middle age and the next generation grew curious about their parents' sacrifices. Documentaries, oral histories, and reunions became more common. Aircraft preservation groups sprang up around the country, determined to locate, restore, and preserve the iconic machines of the greatest generation. While the Mustang, the Corsair, and the Hellcat took center stage, enthusiasts began asking deeper questions about the lesser-known fighters, the canceled projects, and the innovations that had never reached the front lines. That curiosity sparked a handful of serious research efforts into the Skyrocket. Aviation historians dug into Navy records, tracked down surviving engineering notes, and interviewed aging test pilots who had once flown the prototypes. The aircraft's story, once scattered across dusty file cabinets and forgotten airfields, began to take shape. Technical diagrams were recovered. A partial fuselage frame was discovered in a storage hangar in Bethpage, New York, believed to be one of the original 3 prototypes. Though too corroded for restoration, it was enough to rekindle interest among historical societies and Grumman alumni. In 1971, a retired Grumman engineer named Walter Bellamy gave a presentation at a naval aviation symposium titled "The Plane That Never Fought." His talk focused entirely on the F5F Skyrocket. To a room of engineers, designers, and a few surviving pilots, he laid out the design's advantages, the production politics that doomed it, and the hypothetical combat roles it might have filled. The crowd, most of them seasoned professionals, listened in rapt silence. Bellamy concluded by saying, "We didn't lose her to the enemy, we lost her to the calendar. She came too soon." That phrase stuck. Over the years, "came too soon" became the unofficial tagline of the F5F Skyrocket among aviation circles. Books about rare or experimental aircraft often included a page or two on the Skyrocket, always with a tone of regret and admiration. Unlike some designs that failed due to poor performance or engineering flaws, the Skyrocket's failure was rooted entirely in circumstances, timing, priorities, politics. It had been a solid design, well executed, and with clear advantages. But it had simply not fit the moment. In the 1980s, as aviation museums continued to grow and digital record keeping made archival research easier, enthusiasts pushed once again for a replica. A handful of volunteers, mostly former engineers, naval historians, and retired pilots started gathering surviving documents, photographs, and parts. Their goal was not to build a flying version, but a full-scale static model that could be displayed in a museum. Funding was limited, and enthusiasm was confined to a niche community, but the effort carried a sense of personal mission. They weren't just rebuilding an aircraft. They were rebuilding a legacy. By 1992, a partially reconstructed Skyrocket mock-up was unveiled at a small airshow in Long Island. It was made of wood and fiberglass, modeled as closely as possible on the original plans. Painted in navy gray and carefully weathered, it bore the serial number of one of the original test units. Visitors, many unfamiliar with the name, stopped to stare. Some assumed it was a science fiction plane. Others mistook it for a late-war design. But when they read the placard and heard the stories told by volunteers, a common response echoed again and again. Why didn't they use this one? That question, repeated thousands of times over the years, is perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the F5F Skyrocket. It is the question that haunts every promising innovation that comes too soon or gets lost in the shuffle. In the case of the Skyrocket, it reflects not failure, but missed potential in aircraft that could have soared but never left the runway of history. Its story is not one of tragedy, but of quiet endurance, of a design that refused to be erased. The passage of time has a strange way of reshaping memory. In the decades that followed its cancellation, the Grumman F5F Skyrocket evolved from a forgotten prototype into a kind of quiet legend among those who understood its story. It never fired a shot, never rolled off an assembly line, never appeared in black and white war reels taking off from carriers under enemy fire. But for engineers, historians, and a few sharp-eyed readers of old comic books, the name Skyrocket came to mean something more than just another aircraft. It became a symbol of innovation denied by circumstance, a ghost from an era that moved too quickly to take notice. By the 2000s, digital restoration and simulation technology gave the Skyrocket a new lease on life. Flight simulator communities, especially those focused on historical military aviation, began recreating the aircraft in virtual form. Designers painstakingly modeled the F5F using blueprints salvaged from archives and memoirs from former Grumman employees. Within the virtual skies, the Skyrocket finally flew the missions it never got to fly. It soared off carriers, danced in the clouds with Zeros, and escorted bombers across fictional Pacific Islands missions, born from research, respect, and imagination. For younger generations, many of whom first encountered the Skyrocket through mods and simulations, it was no longer a forgotten relic. It was alive, digital, and thrilling. These recreations sparked broader interest. Aviation YouTubers and podcasters began telling its story, blending historical footage with interviews, 3D renderings, and speculative scenarios. What if the Skyrocket had been deployed to Midway? Could it have changed the outcome of early Pacific battles? These were the kinds of questions that engaged the curious, that brought new light to an old mystery. And with every retelling, the aircraft gained a little more recognition, not because it was victorious in battle, but because it represented something universally understood, the frustration of seeing something great fall through the cracks. For Grumman, now absorbed into larger defense contractors over the years, the Skyrocket became a footnote in its lineage, but a respected one. Former employees still brought it up during tours and seminars, noting that many of the company's later breakthroughs were seated in the F5F's engineering DNA. One senior engineer who worked on the F-14 Tomcat once remarked that, in some ways, the Skyrocket was our first real step toward thinking beyond the battlefield of today. That sentiment held true for anyone who saw the aircraft, not just as a product of its time, but as a vision that leaped ahead of it. Surviving photos of the aircraft, though few in number, began to circulate in higher quality. Some showed the F5F sitting sleek and poised on test fields, sunlight glinting off its polished fuselage. Others captured it in motion, rare shots of the prototype, banking sharply above Long Island skies, or climbing hard with both engines roaring. These images, previously tucked away in folders and film reels, became part of online archives, sparking new discussions, tributes, and even fan art that reimagined the Skyrocket in active combat formations it never truly joined. Then came a breakthrough that surprised even seasoned aviation historians. In a quiet warehouse in California, a retired aerospace engineer clearing out old property came across a crate of parts labeled Skyrocket No. 3. Inside were portions of an original wing spar, sections of nacelle framework, and a partial cowling believed to have belonged to one of the last F5F prototypes, thought destroyed or dismantled after the war. The parts were corroded, but largely intact. After years of skepticism, it seemed the fragments of the real aircraft still survived. News of the find rippled through the aviation community. The restoration group that had built the fiberglass mock-up in the 90s was contacted, and plans were set in motion to preserve the parts and, if possible, integrate them into a new static display. Not for flight, not for combat, but for history, for recognition. By 2020, with enough resources and renewed public interest, a new, more accurate replica of the Skyrocket was under construction, this time using recovered components and historically verified blueprints. When the replica was completed and displayed at a commemorative event in Pensacola, Florida, visitors gathered around it with a mix of curiosity and reverence. Some veterans in attendance had flown similar aircraft in the war. Others had only seen the Skyrocket in comics or online. But everyone could feel what it represented: an American aircraft that never went to war, but embodied the spirit of the men who designed, built, and believed in it. That belief, the unshakable American conviction that we can always do better, was alive in the shape of the plane, in its twin engines, in its forward cockpit that still looked modern, even 80 years after its first flight. It's true that most people won't remember the F5F Skyrocket. It didn't win dogfights over the Coral Sea or blaze across Okinawa skies. But among those who look deeper, who see the story behind the story, the Skyrocket represents something just as valuable. It represents the idea that greatness isn't always loud, that not every contribution wears medals, and that some of the most forward-thinking designs are the ones that never made it off the drawing board in time. In America, we celebrate winners. But we also respect the bold, the dreamers, the engineers, the mavericks who take risks and build things that the world isn't quite ready for. The Grumman F5F Skyrocket was one of those things. Fast, elegant, and ahead of its time. It was an aircraft that never had its moment in battle, but never needed one to earn its place in aviation lore. It soared in potential, if not in war. And maybe, in the end, that's just as American as victory itself.